Everyone believed the old apple orchard had been abandoned for years. They were wrong. When Sarah Whitmore returned with nothing but an old letter and a brass key left by her grandmother, she expected to find only broken memories. Instead, she discovered a hidden cellar that had been locked and untouched for 30 years. No one in town would explain why. And what waited behind that door wasn't treasure. It was a family secret someone had spent 3 decades trying to keep buried. This heartwarming story may change the way you see family, forgiveness, and the true meaning of coming home. Late October had settled gently over the Wenatchee Valley in Washington. Rows of apple trees stretched across the hills, their branches glowing with the last deep red fruit of the season. A cool breeze carried the scent of apples, damp earth, and wood smoke from distant farmhouses. From a distance, everything looked peaceful, like the kind of place where every family had roots, and every story had a happy ending. But sometimes, the quietest places carry the heaviest secrets. Her name was Sarah Whitmore. She was 24 years old. She had no family she could remember, no house to return to. Only an old station wagon that had become both her bedroom and her shelter. Sarah had spent most of her childhood moving through foster homes. By the time she became an adult, she had stopped expecting life to be fair. Still, she never stopped being kind. Every Tuesday after work, she carried bruised apples and leftover bread to the residents of Cedar Grove Retirement Home. One afternoon, an elderly woman smiled and asked, "You always give away the best ones. Why?" Sarah looked down at the apples in her hands and smiled. "My grandmother used to say, 'The sweetest apples are the ones we give away.'" The old woman squeezed her hand. "I wish I'd met her." "So do I," Sarah whispered. A few hours later, everything changed. The fruit-packing warehouse where Sarah worked announced unexpected layoffs. Business had slowed. The workers were being sent home. The manager handed Sarah her final paycheck. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She thanked him anyway. Kindness deserved kindness. Outside, rain began falling across the valley. Sarah climbed into her old station wagon and counted the money she had left. $32. Not enough for a motel. Barely enough for gas. She tried to start the engine. It coughed once, then died. For a long moment, she rested her forehead against the steering wheel. Not because she wanted to quit, only because she was tired. Very tired. Just then, Pastor Daniel from the little church nearby walked over with an umbrella. "I've been meaning to find you," he said gently. He handed Sarah an old envelope, its edges worn with time. "It was left here years ago. It has your name on it." Sarah frowned. "My name?" The pastor nodded. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "My dearest Sarah, if the day ever comes when you have nowhere left to go, come home. The old apple tree is still standing. Someone has been waiting for you. Autumn Ridge Orchard. With all my love. Grandma Evelyn." Sarah read the letter twice, then a third time. A tear slipped quietly down her cheek, because no one had ever written those 2 simple words to her before. Come home. The next morning, she borrowed enough money for a short tow and followed the old directions written on the back of the letter. As the road climbed into the hills, an abandoned orchard slowly appeared through the autumn mist. Most of the trees had grown wild, but one enormous apple tree near the entrance had been carefully pruned. Someone still cared for this place. Beneath its branches stood an elderly man trimming the last apples of the season. He looked up as Sarah approached. The pruning shears slipped from his hand. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the old man smiled, a smile filled with years of quiet hope. "I was beginning to think," he said softly, You'd never find your way home. The old man stood quietly beneath the apple tree. For a few long seconds, neither of them spoke. A cool breeze drifted through the orchard, carrying the scent of ripe apples and damp leaves. Golden leaves floated gently to the ground between them. Then the old man smiled. Not the polite smile strangers exchange. It was the warm smile of someone who had been waiting for a very long time. "I was beginning to think," he said softly, "you'd never find your way home." Sarah blinked. "I'm sorry. I think you have me confused with someone else." The old man let out a quiet laugh. "No. I've been waiting for Evelyn Whitmore's granddaughter." His eyes settled on the silver locket around Sarah's neck. I'd know that locket anywhere. Almost without thinking, Sarah raised a hand to it. "You knew my grandmother. I knew her for most of my life." He stepped forward and held out his weathered hand. "My name is Thomas Bennett. But around here, everyone just calls me Tom." Sarah shook his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, the kind earned after a lifetime of honest work. Tom glanced toward the orchard. "You've had a long day. Come inside. I'll make some coffee." Sarah followed him along a narrow dirt path. The orchard stretched farther than she had imagined. Some rows of trees had grown wild over the years. Others had been carefully pruned. Someone had clearly been caring for this place. "You've been looking after the orchard?" Sarah asked. Tom smiled without looking back. "Every season. For 30 years. Sarah stopped walking. "But everyone said this place was abandoned." "It was. Then why keep working here?" Tom walked over to the largest apple tree on the property. Its trunk was thick and deeply weathered. He rested one hand against the bark, almost like greeting an old friend. "Your grandmother planted this tree the day your mother was born." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "My mother," Tom nodded. "Evelyn believed every child deserved a tree that would grow alongside them. When your mother was little, she'd stand right here every birthday." Evelyn marked her height on the trunk. Sarah stepped closer. Tiny carved lines were still visible beneath the rough bark. Each one marked with a date. Each one recording another year of a little girl's life. Her throat tightened. She had never owned anything that carried memories like this. Tom noticed the tears beginning to form. "She loved your mother more than anything." He paused. "And after everything happened, she never stopped loving you." Sarah lowered her eyes. "I don't remember either of them." "I know." Tom's voice was almost a whisper. "But they remembered you." Those simple words settled deep inside her heart. For most of her life, Sarah had believed she had been forgotten. Now, for the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong all along. Together they walked toward the farmhouse. The old white house had aged with time. The paint had faded. The porch leaned slightly, but fresh flowers still rested beneath the windows. Someone had been tending this place with care. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon, old books, and burning firewood. It felt warm, peaceful, like a place that had been waiting patiently for someone to return. Tom placed a kettle on the stove. "Your grandmother always believed no one should make important decisions on an empty stomach." A few minutes later, he returned with fresh bread, homemade apple butter, and 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Sarah couldn't remember the last time someone had prepared a meal just for her. For a while, they ate in comfortable silence while rain tapped softly against the windows. Finally, Sarah unfolded the letter again. "It says, 'Someone has been waiting for you.'" Tom nodded. "That someone was me. You promised her." "I did. 30 years ago." Sarah looked up. "Why?" Tom stared into the fire for several moments before answering. Because I owed Evelyn more than I could ever repay. He didn't explain further. Instead, he stood. There's something you need to see. They stepped outside once more. The rain had stopped, and a pale afternoon sun filtered through the clouds. Tom led Sarah back to the old apple tree. Slowly, he knelt beside its roots and brushed away a thick layer of fallen leaves. Beneath them lay a flat stone almost hidden by moss. Sarah helped him move it aside. Under the stone was an old iron ring. She frowned. "What's this?" Tom wrapped his fingers around the ring and pulled. A wooden hatch slowly lifted from the ground. Cool air drifted up from the darkness below. Sarah stared. "A cellar." Tom nodded. "Most people think it's just an old root cellar. But your grandmother used it for something much more important." Stone steps disappeared into the darkness. Sarah felt an unexpected chill. Not fear. Something else. Curiosity. Almost as if the place itself had been waiting. Tom reached into his jacket pocket and removed an old brass key. Its surface had grown dull with age. He turned it slowly in his hand before holding it out to her. "Evelyn gave me this the week before she passed away." Sarah looked at the key. "What does it open?" Tom smiled sadly. "She told me never to unlock that cellar. Not until you came home." Sarah's heartbeat quickened. "You've kept this key." "For 30 years. "I have. And you never looked inside." Tom shook his head. "I gave her my word. I've always believed that some promises are worth keeping." Sarah slowly reached out and accepted the key. It felt surprisingly heavy in her hand, as though it carried 30 years of unanswered questions, 30 years of silence, 30 years of hope. Just then, a gentle gust of wind swept through the orchard. A single bright red apple dropped from the old tree and landed softly at Sarah's feet. Tom looked at it and smiled. "Your grandmother used to say, 'The old tree always knows when the time has come.'" Sarah looked from the apple to the hidden cellar, then back to the brass key resting in her palm. Deep inside, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever had been hidden beneath Autumn Ridge Orchard, it had been waiting for her. And after 30 long years, the waiting was finally over. Sarah stood at the edge of the open hatch without moving. The old brass key rested quietly in her palm. For a moment, she simply stared into the darkness below. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the scent of old cedar, dry earth, and something strangely familiar like a room that had been closed for decades, yet never forgotten. Tom lit an old oil lantern. Its warm glow pushed back the shadows just enough to reveal a narrow stone staircase disappearing underground. He handed the lantern to Sarah. "I've carried this key for 30 years, he said softly. "But whatever's down there, it belongs to you." Sarah looked at him. "Aren't you coming?" Tom smiled gently. "I'll follow, but you should take the first step." She nodded. Slowly, she placed one hand against the cool stone wall and began walking down the stairs. Each step echoed through the silence. The deeper she went, the quieter the world above seemed to become. When she reached the bottom, she stopped. The cellar was much larger than she had imagined. It wasn't damp or abandoned. It looked cared for. Wooden shelves lined the walls. Glass jars filled with preserved fruit still stood in perfect rows. Old farming tools hung neatly where someone had left them years ago. Nothing felt forgotten. It felt protected. Tom joined her a moment later. Evelyn believed that if people cared for something long enough, he said quietly, time would learn to respect it. Sarah slowly turned in a circle, taking everything in. Then her eyes settled on the far end of the room. There, beneath a white linen cloth covered in years of dust, stood an old wooden chest. It wasn't especially large, but something about it drew her attention immediately. The chest was made of dark walnut, reinforced with hand-forged iron corners. Its surface was beautifully carved with apple blossoms winding around a single tree. Sarah took a slow step forward. "So this is what Grandma wanted me to find." Tom didn't answer. Instead, he walked beside her and carefully brushed the dust from the lid. In the center was a small carving, an apple tree. Its roots spread deep into the wood. Around the trunk were 3 tiny initials. E-R-S. Sarah frowned. E. Evelyn. She traced the second letter. Right. Tom smiled. Rebecca, your mother. Sarah swallowed. Then her finger rested on the final letter. S. Her own initial. Her heart skipped. My grandmother made this. For all 3 of us. Tom nodded. 3 generations. She always believed your family's story wasn't finished. Sarah could barely breathe. Everything suddenly felt deeply personal, as though her grandmother had prepared this moment years before it ever happened. She reached for the brass lock. It opened with almost no resistance. No rust. No struggle. Almost as if someone had expected it to be opened one day. The lid creaked softly. Inside, there was no gold, no jewelry, no hidden fortune. Instead, everything had been wrapped carefully in layers of soft linen. Sarah lifted the top cloth. Beneath it lay a faded quilt, stitched by hand. Tiny apple blossoms decorated every square. Tom smiled. Your grandmother made that while your mother was expecting you. Sarah gently touched the fabric. It felt surprisingly soft. She imagined her grandmother sitting by the fireplace, sewing each stitch with hands she had never held. A lump formed in her throat. Under the quilt rested a small wooden music box. Sarah opened it. A gentle melody filled the cellar. Simple, peaceful. Tom's eyes became distant. Evelyn used to play that every Christmas. Sarah smiled through tears. I don't remember it. No, but somewhere. I think your heart does. When the music stopped, the silence felt even deeper. Sarah lifted another layer of linen. This time she found dozens of photographs. Black and white pictures, family picnics, apple harvest festivals, children laughing beneath the old orchard. One photograph caught her attention. It showed a young woman standing beside the very same apple tree outside. She was laughing. Her hair danced in the wind. She looked almost exactly like Sarah. My mother. Tom nodded. Rebecca. Sarah stared at the photograph for several long seconds. For 24 years she had imagined her mother's face. Now she was finally looking into her eyes. Without realizing it, she whispered, Hello, Mom. A tear landed softly on the photograph. Tom quietly looked away, giving her the privacy of that moment. After a while, Sarah continued searching through the chest. There were birthday cards, recipes written in Evelyn's careful handwriting, pressed autumn leaves, a tiny pair of baby shoes. Each item felt less like an object, and more like proof that someone had loved her long before she could remember. Then, her fingers touched something different, a leather-bound journal. Unlike everything else, it wasn't wrapped in cloth. Instead, a blue ribbon had been tied around it. Tucked beneath the ribbon was a small envelope. On the front, written in elegant handwriting, were just 7 words. For Sarah, when she is ready. Sarah's hands began to tremble. This was written for me. Tom quietly nodded. Evelyn wrote it during the last months of her life. She told me never to read it. Sarah carefully untied the ribbon. The leather cover creaked as she opened the journal. Inside the front page, another handwritten note appeared. My sweet Sarah, if you are reading these words, then life has finally brought you home. There are truths I prayed you would never have to carry. But there are also promises that cannot die with the people who made them. Sarah felt her heart pounding. She turned the page. Her grandmother's handwriting remained steady. Beautiful, patient. Then, everything changed. The next sentence made the color drain from Sarah's face. Your mother did not die in an accident. The lantern trembled in her hands. The cellar seemed suddenly colder. She read the line again, then a third time. Hoping she had misunderstood, she hadn't. Tom watched her quietly. His face told her everything before he spoke. I hoped, he whispered, that somehow those words wouldn't hurt quite so much. Sarah slowly looked up. Tears filled her eyes. What does she mean? Tom closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then he answered with a sadness that had clearly lived inside him for decades. It means everything you've believed about your family was only part of the story. Sarah couldn't speak. She simply stared at the first sentence over and over again. Your mother did not die in an accident. The words refused to make sense. For 24 years, they had been the only explanation anyone had ever given her. A tragic accident, a rainy night, a car that never made it home. It was the story every social worker had repeated. The story every official record carried. The story Sarah had forced herself to accept because she had nothing else. Now, everything she believed about her own life was beginning to unravel. She looked up at Tom. You knew. His shoulders sank beneath the weight of memories he had carried far too long. I knew enough to understand Evelyn was protecting something, but she never told me everything. She believed the fewer people who knew the truth, the safer you would be. Sarah lowered her eyes to the journal again. Her grandmother's handwriting continued. Rebecca discovered something she was never supposed to see. At first, she thought someone had made a mistake. She believed honest people would correct it if they simply knew the truth. She was wrong. Sarah's breathing became slower. She turned another page. For years, the company everyone trusted had secretly buried contaminated waste on farmland surrounding the valley. They poisoned the soil, then falsified every inspection report. Most people never knew. The orchards continued producing beautiful apples. But beneath the roots, the earth was slowly dying. Sarah frowned. She remembered hearing older people talk about several family farms that had quietly disappeared decades earlier. Everyone blamed bad harvests, or bad luck. No one had ever mentioned contamination. The journal continued. Rebecca was working in the accounting office when she noticed payments that didn't match any legitimate business expense. Money was disappearing. Large amounts, always under different names. When she began asking questions, people stopped smiling at her. Sarah slowly closed her eyes. She could almost picture her mother, young, determined, believing honesty was enough to change the world. The next page held something folded inside. Carefully, Sarah opened it. A yellowed newspaper clipping slipped into her hands. Local accountant dies in highway accident. The article was barely half a page long. Just another unfortunate tragedy. Nothing more. Tom quietly watched her reading. That article never felt right. Sarah looked at him. What do you mean? I helped pull your mother's car from the ditch. Sarah's head lifted immediately. You were there. Tom nodded. I volunteered with the volunteer fire department back then. His voice grew quieter. I'll never forget what I saw. He paused. There were no skid marks. Sarah stared at him. The road was wet. There should have been. Silence settled between them. Tom continued. The sheriff called it an accident before anyone even finished looking. I remember thinking, how could he already know? Sarah felt a chill spread through her body. Another page waited inside the journal. This time, tucked between the pages, was a cassette tape. Across the label, Evelyn had written only 3 words. Rebecca's last recording. Sarah's hands trembled. Is this? Tom nodded. Your mother recorded it the night before she died. I've never listened to it. Evelyn wouldn't allow it. She said it belonged to you. Sarah looked toward an old cassette player resting on a nearby shelf. Dust covered its surface. Tom gently wiped it clean. I replaced the batteries every Christmas. Sarah blinked. You, what? Tom smiled faintly. I didn't know when you'd come, but I wanted it ready. The kindness of that simple act almost broke her heart. For 30 years, someone had quietly prepared for a day he wasn't even sure would ever arrive. Sarah carefully placed the cassette into the player. The machine clicked softly. For a moment. Nothing. Then static. A few seconds later, a woman's voice filled the cellar. Soft. Calm. Almost unbelievably familiar. Testing. If this recorder is working. A nervous laugh. I suppose that's a good start. Sarah stopped breathing. It wasn't just a voice. It was her mother's voice. Young. Warm. Alive. Tears rolled silently down her face. The recording continued. If you're hearing this. Then I wasn't able to come back. Sarah covered her mouth. Every word felt like it had traveled across time itself. Rebecca spoke slowly, not like someone who expected to die, but like someone preparing for a possibility she couldn't ignore. I've discovered documents proving that several powerful people have been lying to this town for years. The orchards everyone loves, the rivers children play in. They've all been poisoned for profit. Sarah looked at Tom. His face had turned pale. Rebecca continued, If anything happens to me, please don't hate anyone. Hatred grows faster than truth, and once it takes root, it poisons every heart it touches. Sarah closed her eyes. The words sounded less like evidence, and more like a mother speaking directly to the daughter she would never see grow up. The recording continued. Sarah. She froze. It was the first time her mother had spoken her name. If you're old enough to understand these words, then you've already survived more than I ever wanted for you. Please remember something. Being kind does not make you weak. Sometimes. Kindness is the bravest choice a person can make. The tape clicked. Silence. No dramatic ending. No final goodbye. Just silence. Sarah sat motionless. She wasn't crying anymore. She simply stared at the old cassette player. Tom quietly spoke. Your mother sounded just like Evelyn. Sarah nodded slowly. I think I finally know where my grandmother's words came from. Tom smiled. The sweetest apples. Sarah finished the sentence. Are the ones we give away. For the first time in her life, those words carried an entirely different meaning. They weren't really about apples. They were about choosing generosity over bitterness, hope over fear, love over revenge. Sarah looked down at the journal resting in her lap. She realized something that had never occurred to her before. Her grandmother hadn't hidden these things because she wanted revenge. She had protected them, until someone was ready to carry the truth without carrying hatred. And in that quiet cellar beneath the old apple tree, Sarah understood that the greatest inheritance her family had left her wasn't the orchard. It wasn't the land. It wasn't even the evidence. It was the courage to tell the truth, without allowing the truth to turn her heart into something hard. The cellar was silent once again. Only the soft crackle of the lantern could be heard. Sarah sat with the journal resting on her lap, unable to look away from the final page she had just read. For 24 years, she had believed she was an orphan because of a tragic accident. Now she knew something entirely different. Her mother had died trying to protect people she would never meet. Her grandmother had spent the rest of her life protecting the truth. And Tom had protected both, not because anyone forced him to, because he had given his word. For a long time, no one spoke. Outside, the wind moved gently through the orchard, making the branches whisper above the hidden cellar. Finally, Tom broke the silence. Evelyn used to come down here every autumn. Sarah looked up. Even after my mother died, Tom nodded. Every year, she'd dust the shelves, check the journals, replace the cloth around the chest, and before she left, he smiled sadly. She always said the same thing. What did she say? Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs someone brave enough to carry it. Sarah lowered her eyes. Those words settled deep inside her heart. She suddenly understood why her grandmother had never rushed to expose everything. She hadn't been protecting the guilty. She had been protecting the only person she had left. Sarah. Tom slowly reached into another drawer built into the side of the chest. I think Evelyn wanted you to have these too. Inside were several neatly tied envelopes. Alongside them rested a worn leather folder. Sarah carefully untied the ribbon. The first envelope contained property records. The second held tax receipts dating back decades. The third contained handwritten notes about every apple tree in the orchard. When she opened the leather folder, she stopped breathing. It wasn't another journal. It was a deed. Across the top were the words, Autumn Ridge Orchard. Below them, the owner's name, Sarah Whitmore. She stared at the document in disbelief. My name. Tom smiled. Evelyn transferred the property into a family trust before she passed away. There was only one condition. Sarah looked at him. You had to come home willingly. No one was ever allowed to force you. Tears filled Sarah's eyes again. So, this place, it belongs to me. Tom nodded. It always has. You just didn't know it. Sarah looked around the cellar, then toward the ceiling, where faint sunlight filtered through the cracks above. For the first time in years, she wasn't wondering where she would sleep that night. She already knew. Home. The word still felt unfamiliar, yet somehow, it also felt right. Tom unfolded a yellowed map from inside the folder. The orchard covers almost 40 acres. Most of the trees are old, but they're healthy. We've kept them alive. Sarah looked at him in surprise. Tom chuckled. A few old neighbors refused to give up on this place. They came every spring. They never asked questions. They simply believed Evelyn deserved to have someone watching over her orchard. Sarah smiled softly. People she had never met had quietly protected her family's home for decades. The thought humbled her. Tom pointed toward one corner of the map. That section was planted by your grandmother. The trees near the creek were planted by your mother. Then he pointed toward a wide-open field that had never been cultivated. Evelyn always said, those acres belong to you. Sarah looked puzzled. She left them empty, and Tom nodded. She said your future shouldn't be decided by anyone else. You would know what to plant there when the time came. Sarah folded the map carefully. For the first time since arriving at the orchard, she wasn't thinking about the past. She was thinking about tomorrow. As they climbed the cellar steps, the afternoon sun was beginning to break through the clouds. The orchard looked different now. Not because anything had changed. Because Sarah had. She walked toward the old apple tree. Its branches swayed gently in the breeze. Tom stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" Sarah smiled faintly. "My whole life. I kept looking for somewhere to belong." She rested one hand against the rough bark. "And all this time, I already did." Tom nodded. "That's what home does. It waits." Just then, the sound of an engine echoed across the quiet valley. Both of them turned. A black luxury SUV had stopped near the entrance gate. Neither of them recognized the vehicle. A man in an expensive coat stepped out and looked slowly across the orchard. His eyes stopped on Sarah. He smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. Tom's expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I prayed they would never find out you came back." Sarah looked at him. "Who is he?" Tom never took his eyes off the man walking toward them. "The reason your grandmother kept those journals hidden." The stranger removed his gloves as he approached. Then he spoke with calm confidence. "Miss Whitmore, I've been looking for you." Sarah's heart began to race. Somehow, before the man had said another word, she already knew. Coming home had never been the end of her family's story. It was only the beginning. The man stopped a few feet away. He looked to be in his early 60s, wearing an expensive wool coat that seemed strangely out of place among the weathered apple trees. His polished shoes sank slightly into the damp autumn soil, but he didn't seem to notice. He offered a polite smile. "My name is Charles Davenport. I understand this orchard now belongs to you." Sarah looked at him calmly. "It does." He reached into his coat and removed a leather folder. "Then perhaps we can help each other." Tom quietly stepped beside Sarah. "What do you want, Charles?" Davenport glanced at him with a familiar smile. "You've always been protective of this place, and you've always made my visits difficult." Tom didn't answer. Instead, he folded his arms and waited. Davenport opened the folder. "I'd like to buy Autumn Ridge Orchard." Sarah shook her head almost immediately. "I'm not interested." "You haven't even heard my offer." "I don't need to." He smiled, as though he had expected that answer. "I'll pay $5 million. The number hung quietly in the air. $5 million. Sarah had spent years wondering whether she could afford a warm meal or enough gas to make it through another week. $5 million could change everything. A safe home, a reliable car, a future without uncertainty. For just a brief moment, she imagined what life could be like if she accepted. Davenport noticed the hesitation. "You've struggled long enough. You deserve a chance to start over. You don't owe this old orchard anything." Sarah slowly looked beyond him. The old apple tree stood quietly in the afternoon light. Its branches swayed gently in the breeze. She remembered the words from her grandmother's letter. "The old apple tree is still standing." Then another voice echoed inside her heart. Her mother's. "Don't let fear decide who you become." Sarah looked back at Davenport. "I'm sorry." "My answer is still no." For the first time, his smile faded. "I was hoping we could settle this peacefully." Tom took one step forward. "We already have." "You should leave." Davenport slipped the papers back into the folder. Before turning away, he placed a business card on the hood of Sarah's station wagon. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me." Without another word, he climbed into his SUV and drove away. Only after the vehicle disappeared down the country road did Tom finally exhale. Sarah looked at him. "You know him." Tom nodded slowly. "He represented the company years ago. The same company your mother was investigating." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. So he knows. He suspects enough to be worried. They walked back toward the farmhouse without saying another word. That evening, Tom sat quietly beside the fireplace, repairing an old wooden apple crate. Sarah wandered through the house, studying the faded photographs that covered the walls. There was Evelyn smiling beneath the orchard blossoms, Rebecca standing beside the old apple tree, and then a photograph Sarah had never seen before. A little girl, barely 2 years old, laughing in the grass beneath that same tree. It was her. She gently lifted the frame. Someone had cared enough to save that memory. Someone had believed she would come back one day to see it. "I wish I'd known you," she whispered. Outside, the wind grew stronger. Just after midnight, Sarah woke to the smell of smoke. She hurried onto the porch. Orange flames lit up the darkness. "The packing barn," Tom shouted. Both of them ran across the orchard. Neighbors began arriving almost immediately. Someone brought hoses. Someone else carried buckets. Another called the fire department. Together, they fought the fire until the flames finally died. The old barn still stood. Its walls were blackened. Its roof was damaged, but it had survived. The fire chief examined the doorway with a flashlight. "This wasn't an accident," he said quietly. "The lock was forced. Someone broke in." Tom lowered his head. "They're trying to scare us." Sarah stared at the burned wood. Only a few days earlier, she would have walked away. That had always been her way. When life became difficult, she left before losing anything else. But this place was different. This wasn't simply an old orchard. It was her family's story, her grandmother's promise, her mother's unfinished dream. And now, it had become her responsibility. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Before sunrise, pickup trucks began pulling into the orchard. An elderly farmer unloaded stacks of lumber. A retired carpenter carried in his toolbox. 2 neighbors brought fresh paint. Mrs. Harper from Cedar Grove Retirement Home arrived with homemade pies and a basket of warm biscuits. Sarah looked around in surprise. "You didn't have to do this." The old farmer smiled. "Years ago, Evelyn helped my family keep our farm." Another neighbor nodded. "Rebecca tutored my daughter after school." Mrs. Harper laughed softly. "And your grandmother never let anyone in this town feel alone." The carpenter rested a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "So now, it's our turn." Sarah stood silently as people she had never met worked side by side, repairing the barn without asking for anything in return. For the first time in her life, she understood something her grandmother had tried to teach through simple acts of kindness. Goodness doesn't disappear. It travels quietly from one life to another, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations. As evening settled over the valley, Tom walked toward her carrying a small wooden box. "I almost forgot. This belongs to you." Sarah opened it carefully. Inside was a cloth pouch filled with apple seeds. On the inside of the lid, Evelyn had written one final message. "Plant these when you finally believe tomorrow is worth growing." Sarah read the words twice. Then she looked across the open field her grandmother had deliberately left untouched. For years, she had spent her life searching for somewhere she belonged. Now she realized something extraordinary. She hadn't inherited an orchard. She had inherited hope. She closed the box gently and smiled through tears. Tomorrow no longer frightened her. For the first time in 24 years, she wasn't simply surviving. She was finally beginning to build a life worth protecting. Winter arrived quietly in the Wenatchee Valley. The last apples had long been harvested, and a thin blanket of snow covered the rolling hills of Autumn Ridge Orchard. For the first time in decades, The old farmhouse no longer felt empty. Warm light glowed through its windows every evening. Neighbors stopped by with fresh bread, homemade soup, and stories that had waited years to be told. And for Sarah, life was no longer something she simply endured. It had become something she was finally ready to build. A few weeks after leaving the orchard, Sarah delivered Evelyn's journals, Rebecca's recording, and every document they had protected for so many years to federal investigators. Unlike the people in the valley, those investigators had no old loyalties. They followed facts. One document led to another. One witness found the courage to speak, then another. Slowly, the truth that had been buried for nearly 30 years began rising into the light. Financial records matched hidden payments. Environmental reports proved contamination that had been covered up for decades. Former employees admitted they had been pressured into silence. Some confessed because they were tired of carrying the guilt. Others simply realized it was finally time to tell the truth. Charles Davenport was questioned again and again. Several former executives faced criminal charges for fraud, environmental violations, and destroying evidence. For years, they had protected their reputations. Now, they were forced to face the consequences of their choices. But what mattered most to Sarah wasn't seeing people punished. It was seeing her mother remembered honestly. When the final investigation report was released, Rebecca Whitmore's name was finally cleared. She was no longer remembered as a reckless young accountant involved in a tragic accident. She was recognized as a woman who had risked everything to protect her community. That meant more to Sarah than any courtroom victory ever could. One cold Saturday morning, nearly the entire valley gathered beneath the old apple tree. There were no television cameras, no reporters, just neighbors, farmers, teachers, retired couples, families whose lives had quietly crossed paths with Evelyn and Rebecca many years before. The mayor stepped forward, carrying a small bronze plaque. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. Some debts can never truly be repaid, but gratitude should never remain unspoken. He pulled away the cloth covering the memorial. The plaque read, "Rebecca Whitmore. She chose truth over comfort." So future generations could choose hope. Sarah reached out and gently brushed her fingers across the engraved letters. She closed her eyes. For years, she had imagined what she would say if she could speak to her mother again. Now, she didn't feel the need for words. She simply felt peace. Tom stood beside her. Quiet as always. "I think Evelyn would have smiled today," he said. Sarah looked toward the old apple tree. "I think she already knew this day would come." When spring returned, so did the orchard. Tiny green buds appeared on every branch. The valley slowly awakened after the long winter. One bright morning, Sarah opened the small wooden box her grandmother had left behind. Inside were the apple seeds. The same seeds Evelyn had told her to plant when she finally believed tomorrow was worth growing. This time, she didn't hesitate. With Tom standing beside her, Sarah planted the very first row. Soon, neighbors arrived with shovels. Children from the local school asked if they could help. Retired farmers shared decades of knowledge about pruning and caring for young trees. Before long, the empty field Evelyn had left untouched was filled with new life. Not because Sarah could do it alone, but because hope has always grown stronger when people nurture it together. The old packing barn was rebuilt instead of replaced. The fire-blackened beams were carefully restored. One corner became a community kitchen where anyone struggling could sit down to a warm meal. Another became a workshop where retired craftsmen taught woodworking, gardening, and orchard care to young adults leaving foster care. Sarah wanted them to experience something she had searched for most of her life. A place where someone expected them to come back. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after Sarah first arrived at the orchard. Familiar voices echoed across the yard. Mrs. Harper stepped through the gate carrying an empty basket. Behind her walked several residents from Cedar Grove Retirement Home. Mrs. Harper smiled. "I heard the first harvest is finally ready." Sarah laughed softly. "I saved the best apples for all of you." Mrs. Harper picked up one bright red apple and held it in both hands. She studied it for a long moment before looking at Sarah. "Your grandmother would be proud." Sarah smiled. "I hope so." The older woman shook her head gently. "Oh, sweetheart. I don't think she hoped. I think she knew." As the visitors headed home, the orchard slowly grew quiet again. The evening sun settled behind the Cascade Mountains, painting the sky in warm shades of gold and amber. Sarah and Tom sat beneath the old apple tree. Neither of them felt the need to hurry the silence. After several minutes, Tom spoke. "You know, for years I believed I was protecting this orchard." Sarah turned toward him. "Weren't you—" Tom smiled and rested one hand against the old tree. "No, it was this orchard that protected all of us." Sarah looked across the valley, the young trees swaying in the breeze, the restored barn filled with laughter, neighbors talking on the porch, children running between the rows of apple trees. Only then did she truly understand what Evelyn had left behind. It wasn't land. It wasn't money. It wasn't even the evidence that had finally brought justice. It was something far more valuable. A place where kindness could continue growing long after those who planted it were gone. Sarah reached into her pocket and held the silver locket in her hand. She looked up through the branches toward the evening sky. Then, with tears in her eyes but peace in her heart, she whispered, "I'm home." A gentle breeze moved through the orchard. The leaves rustled softly overhead, and, for just a moment, it almost sounded as though someone was whispering back, "Welcome home." A year passed. Autumn returned to the Wenatchee Valley, and the young apple trees Sarah had planted were beginning to grow. Every morning, she walked through the orchard, caring for them one by one. One Saturday, a group of teenagers from the local foster program arrived to help on the farm. They reminded Sarah of herself only a year before. Lost, uncertain, still searching for a place to belong. She led them to the newest section of the orchard and handed a small packet of apple seeds to the youngest boy. He looked at the seeds, then at Sarah. "What if I'm not here when these trees grow?" Sarah smiled gently. "My grandmother planted the old tree before my mother was born. My mother planted trees she never lived to harvest." She closed the boy's hand around the seeds. "Sometimes the most important things we do in life are the things we'll never see completed." The boy smiled, and together they planted the first tree. Later that afternoon, Sarah filled several baskets with fresh apples and drove to Cedar Grove Retirement Home. Mrs. Harper was waiting by the same window where Sarah had once brought bruised apples during the hardest days of her life. Mrs. Harper took one bite and smiled. "They're sweeter this year." Sarah laughed softly. "My grandmother always said, the sweetest apples are the ones we give away." Mrs. Harper nodded. And she was right. Weeks later, during the annual Harvest Festival, families filled the orchard once again. Children laughed beneath the old apple tree. Neighbors shared homemade pies. Near the entrance stood a simple wooden sign. "No one leaves hungry. No one leaves unwelcome." Tom stood beside Sarah, watching the valley come alive. "I used to think I spent 30 years protecting this orchard," he said. He smiled toward the old apple tree. "But now I realize it was the orchard that protected us." Sarah looked across the rows of young trees, the restored barn, and the people who had become family. She finally understood. Her grandmother hadn't left her an orchard. She had left her a place where kindness could keep growing long after she was gone. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Sarah walked to the old apple tree one last time. She rested her hand against its weathered trunk and opened the silver locket that held her mother's picture. With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "I'm home." A gentle breeze moved through the branches. One ripe apple fell softly into the grass. Sarah picked it up and carried it to a little girl helping clean the orchard after the festival. The child looked up with surprise. For me, Sarah smiled. "Yes, now it's your turn to help someone else someday." The little girl hugged the apple tightly, and in that quiet moment, Sarah realized the greatest harvest had never been the apples. It had always been the kindness passed from one heart to another. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to ask you something. Who planted the first apple tree in your life? Was it a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, or someone whose kindness changed your future? Share their name in the comments. Let's honor the people whose love is still growing in our hearts today. And remember, the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't what we keep. It's what continues to grow because we chose to give it away.